Breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ. The new college football AP Top 25 poll is out after a wild week across the sport, with number 3 Georgia, number 4 Miami, and number 15 LSU losing. Plenty of movement. You are looking at your new AP top 10 teams. Most notable here, Ole Miss surges into the top 10 after a huge win over Georgia. And hello, Indiana, getting the respect they deserve. The Hoosiers improved to 10-0 in the season and move up to 5 after defeating one of the more talented opponents on their schedule in Michigan. BYU also remains undefeated and moves up a few spots you see there, along with Bama, who moves up to 9. A look now at 11 through 20. Georgia and Miami both fall significantly in the rankings after suffering bad losses to their respective opponents. Colorado breaks into the top 20 after a big win in Lubbock. And a look at the rest of the teams that do round out the new AP Top 25 poll. LSU, despite suffering a tough loss to Bama, still ranks there, but fall to 6-3 and 7 spots in the AP poll to 21. We are nearing the end of the regular season as we look to close out a critical month of November. For many teams, we're going to dive into all of this and so much more as we welcome you back to CBS Sports HQ. I'm Jordan Giorgio. Also joining me is Bryant McFadden and Brad Crawford. Brad, let's start with one of the many teams that fell this weekend and lost to an unranked opponent. That was, of course, Miami. They fell to Georgia Tech. As a result, we saw them fall significantly in the AP poll. No signature win really on their resume. So have the voters been pretty generous with Miami throughout the weeks?
Miami has played with fire now 4 times this season, finally got burned in Atlanta against the Yellow Jackets. Miami's best win this season, Jordan, is against 3-loss Louisville. That's the one win Miami has against a team in the playoffs top 25. I think this huge 9-spot drop out of the top 10 is warranted. I think Miami now has to win out just to guarantee itself a spot in the college football playoff. And don't sleep on SMU. That right now is the front runner, in my opinion, in the new look ACC. You see Miami there. Opened the season with 9 straight wins, and then that loss to Georgia Tech really sort of uncovered some wounds, I think, that this team has had throughout the year. They've been able to kind of Band-Aid because of Cam Ward. Didn't happen in Atlanta after that strip sack ended the, Miami's magical season. So Miami, I can see that why they had that 9-spot drop.
And to your point, when you look at Miami, I really feel like, the committee, they revisited the wins they barely had against Virginia Tech, barely had against Cal. You talked about Louisville. That was a close game as well, but they found ways to win those ball games. So some of those things surfaced in yesterday's game against Georgia Tech, but they had the luxury of winning those ball games early in the year. But they finally ran into a buzzsaw. So now they have to play flawless football, but they also need some help because you just saw the ACC standings right there, right? One thing we know for sure, the representative from the AFC to get into the playoffs, the ACC, is the team that wins the conference because the ACC won't have the luxury like an SEC or a Big Ten where you might not play for the championship in the conference and you still get a chance to get into the playoffs. They won't have the same luxury. So the only guaranteed team to get into the playoffs from the ACC, as we see it today, Brad, will be the team that wins the ACC championship. If the ACC championship was to be played tonight, guess what? The Miami Hurricanes would not play for that crown, which would be a huge disappointment for their team based on everything they've done leading up to that Georgia Tech game, having one of the best quarterbacks in college football, dominating the majority of your teams, and you still do not make it to Charlotte. That would be the ultimate disappointment.
Well, Brad, another team that did fall, it was in the top 5, was Georgia. Of course, they fell to Ole Miss. Lane Kiffin and company saved their playoff chances. Ole Miss was ranked 16th in the first college football playoff rankings that were released. They now jump into the top 10. They are in that 10th spot in the latest AP poll that we're breaking down here on CBS Sports HQ. So, Brad, what are their chances, you think, of holding on to being one of those top 12 teams?
Yeah, I think Ole Miss now has a signature win, that Lane Kiffin desperately needed this season to get to the playoff. There are going to be several, maybe 5 or 6 10-win teams, Jordan, that Ole Miss is trying to kind of get out of this logjam with in the SEC. But I think Ole Miss is going to be eventually, 4 weeks from now when the committee meets one final time, the Rebels are eventually going to be one of those last teams in. And now has that head-to-head win over Georgia. So if it's Ole Miss versus Georgia for that last spot, you can't put Georgia in because Ole Miss won on the field. I do think that it would benefit Ole Miss for Georgia to beat Tennessee next week, and then you have Tennessee with 2 losses. It would also benefit if maybe Bama loses a game it shouldn't the rest of the way, maybe lose to Texas in the SEC championship game. But Ole Miss has that bad loss to Kentucky, also lost on the road against LSU, but needed that signature win, and it happened in Oxford.
Well, go ahead, B-Mac.
And I was going to say, Brad, to your point, yes, I think Ole Miss, if they went out, they will get into the playoffs, not even playing for the SEC championship game because of that signature win. But another team that I believe if they went out, they will get into the playoffs as well is the loser in that matchup with Ole Miss, which is UGA. Because next week they have who? Tennessee. Tennessee, a highly ranked team based on the new rankings today. That would be another signature win. But then for Georgia, they already have a signature win. Weeks ago against Texas on the road, dominated the Longhorns. So yes, it was an unforeseen loss in how they lost to Ole Miss, but they have an opportunity to correct their wrongs if they went out and, most importantly, beat Tennessee, who's currently top 6 in college football. That would add to their resume. And one thing I truly believe, the committee, they value Georgia. They value their coaching. They value their style of play. And when you look at already beating, at that time, the #1 team in the country in Texas, if you can take care of your business against Tennessee, I think Georgia will find a way, if they went out, to get into the playoffs when it's all said and done, if those things happen.
So are you giving the edge to Georgia next week?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm at home, not knowing the health status of Nico. Yeah. He was banged up a little bit last night. I understand, and I'm willing to bet Kirby will emphasize the sense of urgency for his ball club. Carson Beck, got to get back on the right track. Running the ball has to be an emphasis in defense. Play the Georgia-style defense. I like Georgia to win that ball game because it's a must-win for the Bulldogs.
All right, it definitely is. Huge matchup in the SEC. Well, that's next week in the conference, but this past weekend in the conference, we saw what looked like the old Bama defeat LSU and eliminate them from playoff contention. Brad, with the win, are Bama's SEC championship hopes still alive here?
Certainly so. Now, things would get much less complicated if Tennessee beats Georgia and Texas beats Texas A&M. Then you have Texas, Tennessee, and Atlanta in a couple weeks, and Bama is probably the 3rd best team with a 10-2 finish with 2 quality wins. Now Georgia, and now they've beaten LSU like a rag doll at night at Tiger Stadium. This Bama team the last 2 weeks, Jordan, has looked a whole lot different than the one we saw during the middle of the season that sputtered against Vanderbilt, barely beat South Carolina, lost to Tennessee. This is the Bama that we thought Kalen DeBoer would have earlier this season. And I think it was a statement victory on the road, doing so in a hostile environment. Jalen Milroe got back to his vintage self, almost 200 yards rushing, 4 touchdowns, just running past Blake Baker's defense in Baton Rouge. Bama has the look of a playoff team. And I think if you asked that same question 3 weeks ago, Bryant and I would have both told you Bama's not a playoff team. So here we are coming down the home stretch. Bama looks like the Bama we thought it would several months ago.
All right, well, B-Mac, last night, as I mentioned, it felt like we were watching the old Bama. Brad agrees, but what is their ceiling if they can run the ball as well as they did against LSU, in your opinion?
They can get to Atlanta. They can win it. They can win it all when you look at their style of play. And it's like the thing about Bama, Brad, we're still trying to figure it out because it's like the Jekyll and Hyde syndrome. You don't know exactly which Alabama team you're going to see, and can they sustain that level of success on either side of the football. Last night, Jalen Milroe running the football, the running backs running the football, right? They weren't one-dimensional when it came to who is getting the football outside of weeks past and what we've seen with Williams and Milroe. They were able to distribute the football equally to their playmakers on the offensive side. And defensively, I mean, Garrett Nussmeier didn't have an answer for their defense. They played a suffocating style in the back end and the secondary. They were great at the point of attack in the trenches. They were very, very physical, and that's why they dominated the LSU Tigers. But moving forward, can they sustain that level of play? Can they sustain that style of play? Kalen DeBoer is trying to implement that into their program. Under the coaching of Nick Saban, that never was a question because they were overly focused. They were dialed in and week out, and that's why we saw the success they had under Nick Saban. Kalen DeBoer is trying to get that going. Let's see, can the win against the Tigers last night really jumpstart a level of consistency which could get them to Atlanta in December.
All right, let's see if the Alabama Crimson Tide can keep things rolling here as they chase the SEC championship. Here's another look at the latest AP Top 25 poll. Ton of upsets this week, a ton of movement as expected. Most notable, we talked about the Ole Miss Rebels. They surge into the top 10 after a huge win over Georgia. Indiana now 10-0 on the season, move up to 5 after defeating Michigan. And BYU also remains undefeated, moves up a few spots there, along with Bama, who moves up 2 spots to 9. Quick break for us here on CBS Sports HQ. When we return, we turn our focus to next week in college football. We showed you the latest AP poll, but how will the College Football Playoff Committee rank teams next week? We give you our predictions next. And is there a scenario where Ashton Genty and Boise State can claim a first-round bye and be one of the top 4 teams? Stay with us.